My name is Rowan Blake, I'm 31, and the night my sister's bridesmaids whispered in satin and the florist tucked peonies like secrets into crystal vases, I learned that some doors open for you only after you stop knocking and start changing the locks. If you're watching this, tell me where you're watching from and hit like and subscribe. Because this is the story of how I was banned from my sister's wedding for something I didn't do. And then, with a quiet kind of planning that looks like patience and a little madness, I walked back through those same doors with the deed in my pocket and the music in my favor, explosive, undeniable, and clean. I grew up in a house that smelled of lemon polish and was paid for by favors my father called networking. My sister Leela was born 3 years after me, and the family seemed to agree the world should be made gentler for her. She learned to smile like a currency and learned how to keep the right hem in view of an audience. I left that home the way good stories go, slowly and with my hands full of the wrong things. A diploma in an art I loved that mom called impractical, a small consulting business that paid by the project, not the title, and a set of friends who answered a 2 a.m. text with a plan and a ride. When I told them I was seeing someone who wasn't a stockbroker, they raised their eyebrows like candles and told me to keep a ledger. When I told them I wanted to buy a small event space to throw community arts nights, poetry, kids' shows, a place where people who had never felt invited could be seen, they nodded like it was harmless and then went on with their appointments. The town had one estate everyone knew, Wrenwood Hall, a place with a glass ballroom, terraces that looked like they'd been measured by poets, and a manager who could make a chandelier seem like it was applauding your entrance. Wrenwood had hosted more marriages than the county clerk and carried a reputation like a badge. Expensive chairs, discreet staff, and a menu that translated status into a plate. When the family decided Leela's wedding would be at Wrenwood, invites went like confetti, photographers were booked, favors were chosen in gold and navy, mother ordered new table runners and practiced what she would say at the head table. I was not on the guest list. That phrasing, "you're not invited," arrived in a text from my mother 2 months before the wedding, unadorned like a public notice. "We've decided it's best if you do not attend. Please respect our wishes." There was no reason given in writing, only a phone call later when she said, "You will understand, Rowan, this is a family matter." I asked for clarity, what family matter, what did I do, and she circled softly and finally said, "Your temperament," which, in their vocabulary, meant I made noise in rooms that required silence. It stung, of course, because being excluded is an old family tool, polished and reliable. My first impulse was to plead, to explain, to remind them of the time I stayed up painting my grandmother's hallway for free because she said she didn't have the money. My second impulse was not to make a scene, because scenes have a way of being cited as evidence against you in perpetuity in that house. Instead, I did what I do, research, quietly, and for weeks I kept a low profile, drank cheap coffee, and watched as invitations arrived with calligraphed names, as bridesmaids measured hemlines in sunlight, as my mother practiced a smile. Leela's dress arrived in a crate and my mother texted a photo with a caption, "Perfection." Then one night, 2 weeks before the wedding, my world rearranged itself into a plan. Wrenwood's owner, a man named Calder Huxley, had been on the market for months, divorce, debts, an unfortunate bet on a hotel chain that hadn't loved him back. The property sat as elegantly distressed as a retiree with a great hat. Owners and brokers walked through and said the same thing, beautiful bones, terrible cash flow. I ran numbers because that's what I do, numbers and the ways people move through rooms. The books told a story of seasonal glory and year-round vacancy. Hump days when maintenance had to be paid, insurance premiums that rose like tide lines, and a manager with the sort of pride that keeps him from negotiating. Something about owning a place where people could be celebrated and also belong drew me like the horizon. The idea was not overnight. I did not pull a bank from a hat. I sat in the library of friends with coffee and spreadsheets and sketch scenarios that looked practical. An LLC to shield privacy, a small partnership with a community investor to cover a down payment, an operations plan that turned unused rooms into rehearsal studios and daytime parking for artists. I spoke to contractors about alternative revenue streams, photo shoots, film days, smaller weekday events, and I made friends with a woman who handled title searches for a living and taught me how deeds are language you can speak like a source of truth. When the property hit the edge of being viable for a buyer who would actually care, I moved quietly, no fireworks, no press releases. I used a modest pool of savings, a partner who believed in the mission, and a shell entity named for a street that meant nothing in the ledger but everything in the name. Buyers are sometimes like predators, they watch a prey's wound and wait. I watched instead and moved with more patience than my family had ever assumed I possessed. Weeks before Leela's wedding, I closed on Wrenwood Hall. The ownership was quiet escrow, keys in neutral hands, the manager notified only of a new operating account and a new email for billing. I did not tell Mother. I did not tell Leela. I told perhaps 2 friends and the contractor who kept his mouth like a vault. I wanted to let the house change shape on its own time. For me, it was always about building a place, not burning a bridge. The week of the wedding was its own festival. The family arrived from planes and sedans and little private jets like a constellation aligning. Mother floated through the house in dresses that could have had their own assistants. My sister called me once, an awkward message after a bridesmaid's fitting, and asked if I understood why they had to flatten the guest list. I answered carefully. She replied, "We don't want drama," as if I were a thunderstorm tamed by polite conversation. On the morning of the wedding, the house smelled like lilies and anticipation. I packed a bag that morning, camera, a plain black dress, my phone fully charged, not because I had planned on attending, but because something small and feral in me wanted to stand where the music would be played. I drove to Wrenwood under a sky rigid with heat. When I pulled up, the valet took my car with the professional indifference of someone who has memorized entitlement. Security, soft, efficient, asked me if I had a name on the list. I said no. They blocked my path like a polite hinge. Sometimes the best revenge is the element of surprise that looks like procedural patience. I watched the bridesmaids across the lawn laugh like seashells, the groomsmen in tuxedos, the florist adjusting a single stem with the attention of a surgeon. Mother's laughter floated like a scent. I could have turned around and gone home. I would have been a good example of being above it, and people would have said I handled exclusion with mature grace. Instead, I opened a small, thin folder I'd kept in my glove compartment. The same folder that held the closing statement, the chain of title, the insurance policy in my LLC's name, a short letter from the previous owner agreeing to transition the staff, and a line from the lender that said in the bland voice of finance, "Ownership transferred as of 10:17 a.m., verified." I slid the documents across the hood and the breath of the world changed just slightly, as if a play had shifted scenes. Security called their radio and someone said, "We have someone claiming ownership," like this was the thing of nightmares. They asked for identification and I gave it, legal and clear. For a while they could do nothing but consult their clipboard and their manager, who called their lawyer, who called their woman in the cropped suit who carried a presence like a paperweight. "Miss Blake, we appreciate your concern, but the wedding will proceed," she said in a voice that didn't want to be cruel but had been taught cruelty as a tool. I put the folder on the hood and opened it like a reveal you save for a curtain. The deed in the LLC's name, a letter of assignment, the manager's signed acceptance of terms, and a line in the escrow agreement that read, "Buyer assumes existing event bookings but reserves right to enforce contract terms regarding venue use and client conduct." Technical, dry translation. I had the legal power to evict, to insist on terms, to stop any event that breached the operations contract I now stood ready to enforce. "You can't," the manager said, which is the sentence people often use when they do not wish to be proved wrong. "I can," I said, and I signed a document for the record that acknowledged my identity and my position. Here's the thing: money and power show up in paperwork and in timing. They also show up in spectacle, and I recognized how the world loves a spectacle that looks like theater instead of cruelty. I did not want to crush my sister at the altar. I wanted to make the moment speak for itself. The wedding planner, a woman named Celeste with a headset and a spine made of silk, had been a maestro of minor emergencies for years. She approached with the precise diplomacy of a conductor whose orchestra was a machine of fragile egos. "Miss Blake, we've been instructed," she started. "Instructed by whom?" I asked, and her jaw tightened not because she had an answer but because she couldn't afford to have one. The guests were arriving in their pastel and pearl armies. The bride's mother adjusted a napkin with a hand that shook not from age, but from the idea that the script could break. I could have called a press conference, had a sign printed, invited cameras. That would have fed the monster with reality TV reflexes. Instead, I walked into the hall. The band, strings and a harp, saw me and then saw my papers and began to play a little louder as if they were making a choice to be on the side of the narrative. My sister turned when I entered as if the room could be split in two by my breath. Her face moved through colors, surprise, confusion, the practiced hurt of a woman ready to be wounded on cue for sympathy. Mother's hand landed on her husband's sleeve like a talisman. "Rowan," Leela said, incredulous. I did not shout. I used a voice tuned to the microphone inside me, clear-edged and warm enough to be dangerous. "Leela," I said, "congratulations." There was a sound between a laugh and a sob from somewhere near the cake table. I could have walked out, shown no papers, left the house to its ritual and let them be saints in their own story. Instead, I moved the music. I asked the band to hold the next piece. This was theater I had prepared for, not the cheap kind, but the sort that finds the note that makes people look up. I asked the DJ, a man the planner trusted because he knew how to read an atmosphere, to come forward, and the DJ believed in the art of a moment and leaned in like someone about to tell a joke only the world would hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, and I sounded like the person I am when I am not being asked to prove anything to anyone but myself. "This is going to be quick." The groom, handsome and taut with nerves, looked like someone who had practiced being startled. The guests leaned forward like a tide. Mother's fingers left her husband's sleeve for the first time that night, and she folded them into her pocket like an argument she meant to keep private. I put the deed on the piano, an act of ordinary gravity, and asked the planner to read the venue contract out loud because atmosphere loves nothing more than clarity. Contracts are a particular kind of honesty. They have no need for sympathy. Celeste obeyed on autopilot before she could think about politics. She read the clause that allowed the owner to enforce conduct and revoke access if the client breached certain conditions the contract spelled out in legal but crystalline language. No harassment, no threats, no behavior that created a hostile environment for guests or staff. There was a clause, standard for events at venues, about mutual respect, the expectation that hosts comport themselves in a way that does not create liability for the venue or harm the staff. I had not wanted to make the family drama public, but the contract was public to those guests because they were privy to it as the event's protectors. And then I stepped further because surprise without a reason is merely entertainment. I asked Celeste to call the house manager to provide a sworn statement she'd signed earlier that week, an internal memo from the planner noting an incident at a rehearsal dinner when a family member had shouted at waitstaff, and a text exchange where my mother insisted on specific seating that had excluded me without cause. The planner's face changed. She had clearly been told to avoid this sort of escalation, yet she read the statements into the room with a voice that shook not from anger but from the knowledge of truth. When the words landed, a manager's complaint about a party guest's treatment of employees, my mother's directive to avoid drama in a way that excluded me intentionally, the effect was volcanic. The guests shifted. I saw a man I didn't recognize set down his champagne like a man who had been asked to read a will. Leela's veil trembled. Mother's jaw tightened until I thought it might click. The groom's best man put his hand over his mouth. The room smelled for a moment of lilies and something like regret. In that silence, I did the spectacular thing I'd been building toward. I asked the planner to check the booking records and announced to everyone present that the owner of the venue was invoking her right to protect staff and guests. And in light of the documented hostile conduct and the family's insistence on my exclusion based on no legitimate safety concern, Wrenwood Hall would rescind access for the family until a time when their behavior complied with the standards in the contract, or until I decided otherwise. You could hear a pin drop if you were old enough to remember a time when pins were valuable. The bride let out a sound that was so human it made my heart reduce to a single slow beat. "Rowan, what are you doing?" Her voice as an accusation had the fragile edge of someone who expected to be defended. I did what I always try to do when an audience is about to stand on 2 feet. I kept it small and direct. "I'm making sure no one who works tonight is treated poorly," I said. I could see the family's spreadsheet of shame scroll behind their eyes. Humiliation, spectatorship, the thought of a ceremony interrupted by an estranged sibling with a cause. Mother's face went very still, like a statue recalibrating, and she said a name like a prayer, "This is monstrous." And I realized then that priests and matriarchs share a language. Sanctimony becomes the shield for selfish choice. People started to argue in the polite ways wealthy people argue, muted tones, clipped sentences, threats veiled as options. The groom's father made a small motion like he might end the spectacle with a show of money. People love to think cash can buy grief away. But I had money too, not enough to drown an estate, but enough to buy the house and the right to say no. I had lawyers on speed dial and an operations manager who knew how to hold the line and staff who felt, finally, defended. There was shouting that rose like a storm, mother's voice thick and venomous, Charles accusing me of a publicity stunt, a cousin calling me ungrateful. But the turning point, the detonator disguised as a domino, was quieter. A young server named Miguel walked to the front carrying a stack of napkins. He cleared his throat, hands visibly trembling, and said, "Ma'am, last week I was yelled at by a family member for getting the water wrong. I'm here to tell you I don't want to be yelled at tonight." The room misunderstood the words initially because they had been conditioned to treat staff testimony as an act of rebellion, but the meaning was simple and mortal. People will not serve if they are not safe. When Miguel's words found the air, something like shame unpinned itself from the walls and fell across the chandelier. Silence turned to motion, phones came out. The photographer who thought himself invincible put down his camera like a soldier resting his gun. Leela shouted that I was destroying her day and that I had chosen to ruin her, which is what people say when they lack the language to account for their own choices. I wanted to say that I hadn't come to ruin her, I'd come to change the conditions that allowed her to treat other people as props in her life. Instead, I made the dramatic choice. I could have walked away. I could have left the wedding to the script. I asked for the microphone. The room tightened as if the air itself was listening for the word that would justify them in the future. "This venue opens its doors to celebrations," I said, and my voice cut a clarity through the tension, "but it does not open its doors to people who make other people feel less safe. This company will not host events that normalize the humiliation of staff or the deliberate exclusion of family without cause. I bought this place because I wanted to build a home for community. Tonight, if any of you cannot accept that your words and actions have consequences, you will be asked to leave. I will not be erased from a family event, and I will not allow anyone to treat another human with less dignity than they deserve." The explosive part, the part that makes gossip and late-night commentary, wasn't the ownership reveal itself. It was the way it forced the audience to choose between the bride's expectation and the dignity of the people who made the party possible. Guests murmured like a sea with a storm under its surface. Some family members cried, some laughed. Some turned away and said nothing, which is a kind of admission too. The planner, who had been trained to love a smooth night above all other virtues, had no script for this. She did what compassionate people do, she put the staff first. After an hour that felt like a week in a weather system where lightning and mercy shared the sky, we struck a compromise that sounded small but was enormous. The ceremony would proceed in the garden, with a public apology from the family at the microphone for any mistreatment of staff, and with a formal pledge to institute an annual staff respect training that the family would fund for the next 5 years. Leela would be married, but under terms that acknowledged the harm and promised to change. It was not perfect. Nothing like this is. Leela cried, the groom looked hollowly relieved yet robbed, and mother's makeup smeared in a way that would have haunted her for days in memory and in mirror. But Miguel kept his job. The caterers finished their shift without being scapegoated. The guests, some of them, learned that privilege can be nudged toward responsibility, and the staff learned that their employer had a new owner who would make a noise for them when they were not in the room. In the weeks that followed, family phone calls arrived like aftershocks. Mother called twice, 3 times, in tones that moved from fury to bargaining to something that negotiated toward a kind of absence. Leela texted a message that read, "Why did you do that?" And I wrote back, "Because you asked me not to come and I could not accept being told I don't belong where I was born. Because I wanted staff to be safe. Because your wedding should not require someone else's erasure to shine." She sent an emoji of a ring and then the phrase, "I'm sorry for the way people treated you," which was the first apology she'd ever conceded publicly. But it came with the small caveat of the life of a bride, time, Instagram, brunches, and it felt honest enough to be the start of something. The town buzzed, articles called it a scandal. Estranged sister quits roster, reveals ownership, and others praised the move as accountability in velvet. I did interviews I didn't want to and offered statements that were careful. A place should be safe for all who work there. Management should bear responsibility for enforcement. Hospitality is a mission. The real victory was quieter. Miguel's daughter received a scholarship to a performing arts school funded anonymously by the Wrenwood Community Fund we set up. And the caterer who had nearly lost money that night received a call from a corporate client who'd been in town for the wedding and wanted to book holiday events with a larger fee. The outcome was messy and human and full of compromise because justice often looks like that, less like a headline and more like repair. Months later, at a town meeting on hospitality standards, my mother stood in the back and listened. She did not applaud, she did not denounce. She was small in a way I had never seen her. Privilege without the script was always awkward, and she left with a bag of brochures about staff welfare initiatives. Leela and I met for coffee once. The conversation was thin and then honest. She asked if I regretted what I'd done. I said sometimes I wish we had found another way, but given the pattern of exclusion, my chest tightened and the answer landed. No, I had stood up in a room full of people who needed to see that leadership wasn't about seating arrangements and that dignity could be enforced without shouting. I had bought a house to build a home, and in doing so, I had changed the terms of what counted as celebration in that corner of town. People still talk about that wedding and the moment I walked in with a folder on my hood like it was a stunt. They are right that it was a stunt in as much as all theatrical justice requires a stage. But it was also a policy change. A set of contracts practiced into being, a staff that felt defended enough to keep doing their work without fear. If this story landed where you're sitting, maybe at an awkward family table or watching a sibling practice being the star, tell me where you're watching from, hit like and subscribe for more tight cinematic tales about choosing action over aching, and share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the most explosive kind of love is the kind that refuses to be silent when someone else is being treated less than human.